politics, it's often very hard for leaders to admit they are wrong, let alone to say sorry. Perhaps that's why last Monday's events in New Zealand was so astounding. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern made a formal apology for the racist policing of Pacific people living in New Zealand in the 1970s. For years, the Pacifica community was terrorised by so-called police dawn raids, in which men and women were pulled from their beds, sometimes from their church pews, and jailed for overstaying their visas. Now, in fact, the majority of visa overstayers at the time were Americans and British. In a moment, we'll speak to a young man who was a driving force in securing the apology, which was backed up with scholarships to Pacific students, a rewriting of the school history curriculum and a pledge to create an official record of the mistreatment. First, though, watch how the New Zealand PM submitted herself to a uniquely Pacific ceremony of reconciliation and atonement.
I use symbolism to paint a picture for those who do not understand the harms of racism on a proud, proud people.
It's the 13th of March 1974, and the headline is 38 islanders were arrested in a series of dawn raids today in what police describe as the biggest clampdown on illegal immigrants.
During the dawn raids era, Pacific families were branded as overstayers and were the target of systemic and personal racist attacks.
I use symbolism to convey to those who were hurt directly that we, the government, understand the trauma and the pain.
I stand on behalf of the New Zealand Government to offer a formal and unreserved apology.
I use symbolism to allow the rest of New Zealand who do not understand this story to be receptive to the message that harm was caused.
They were my parents who are laid to rest at Waikaraka Cemetery in Onehunga, Auckland.
The past actions of the Crown were wrong. The treatment of your ancestors was wrong.
To the petitioners, Josiah Tualamali'i and Benji Timu, thank you for carrying the weight.
And I would say to those peoples, both here and those who have passed, moi mai, moi mai, moi mai rā. Kia ora mai tātou.
You will have just seen their New Zealand parliamentarian Rawiri Waititi refer to Josiah Tualamali'i. Josiah is the co-founder of the Pacific Youth Leadership and Transformation Council, and he was one of the people whose advocacy led to this historic apology. And I'm pleased to say he joins us now from Christchurch, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Josiah, welcome to The Drum.
Maro lava, it's lovely to have some time with you all.
It's so great to see you. I want to start with your story. In the Pacific tradition, we need to understand who you are before we can understand your story. To understand how you helped bring about the apology, you had difficulty as a young boy with your place as a Samoan New Zealander. In fact, you wanted to deny that part of who you were.
100%. I grew up in Dunedin, so a little bit down the road from Christchurch. My dad had moved to Dunedin from Samoa in the mid-80s, in 87, and met my mum, and then I was born a little while later. But in growing up there, I didn't feel I could be confident and comfortable with who I was. The stories that were on TV, on programs like Police 10-7 in New Zealand, and some of the attitudes about who we were made me feel I couldn't be proud of my Samoan heritage. And yeah, and there were some really significant people in my life who I'm still alongside now, who I love deeply, who are really racist, who made me have this self-loathing of myself.
Yeah, and you also talk very openly about being a nerd, and that doesn't really fit the stereotype of a Pacific man, does it?
No, there's a whole perception about the jobs that my communities can achieve and the places that we can be. And I guess some people say you find your fish. Well, the thing that I'm a nerd about is parliamentary practice and people having their voice heard in democracy, which we can aspire to as Pacific peoples, Indigenous Pacific peoples can aspire to anywhere.
Yeah, I just want to out you that it's not just parliamentary procedure, it's also Lego and military uniforms that you're into. Come on, fess up now.
Yeah, fair enough. My uncle's in the American Army. He got enlisted in American Samoa where he was born. And yeah, my brothers and I build Lego starships. So, yeah, we're into some ordinary things too, you know?
So I want you to tell me this story now. The Polynesian Panthers spent 50 years, a social advocacy group, advocating for an apology for this terrible trauma and dislocation caused to Pacific communities from the Dawn Raid. And we saw them agitating around about February this year, and then you and another gentleman who we just saw on tape there came forward and got this letter writing campaign going. And within this really short space of time, there's an apology on the table. What is the magic that you're doing with this youth advocacy? Because you see yourself as the leaders and the politicians, they're just the decision makers you need to help.
That's right. I think the opportunity is that decision makers can have the humility to accept that they don't have all the answers and they're most certainly only there for a little while. So why not use the opportunity to, as one of our leaders often talks about, the only adequate use of power is to empower others, and that being what we try and seek to achieve. And a cool thing about being Samoan, being Pacific, is that we think in a village. We think as a village, even if we don't live in the villages that we have in the Pacific. And that's how we approach these kinds of opportunities, that our matua, so our elders, the Polynesian Panthers and others, were communicating and coordinating and activating in their ways, and we were activating our generation through our approaches. And yeah, I love letter writing, and so to encourage people to write to the Prime Minister is something that they could feel, the government could feel the weight of our words. And watching those images, you know, I'm still, from last week, I'm still kind of overwhelmed by all of it. But that's what you can do when you help people feel like it's something to be part of, and the politicians and leaders to feel like it's something that can help healing.
Deborah, isn't he wonderful? I thought of you when I saw Josiah's story, and thought of your own story of being stolen at 3 weeks of age, and your own story of coming to understand who you are as an Aboriginal woman, as a gay woman, as an opera singer. Talk to me about the thoughts you have when you hear all of what Josiah says.
I'm losing count of the times that I tune into Parliament in New Zealand, and I find myself crying with pride at the demonstration of leadership. Leadership is being able to envisage what is necessary for your citizens, for all of your citizens, and being able to act on that, not just reacting. And the leadership that I'm seeing, I think it stems back to the fact that you do have that, albeit flawed, Treaty of Waitangi. You have a bilingual population there, and culture is very deeply embedded in language, as we know. But when I see the decisions and the emotional maturity of Jacinda Ardern, I know what leadership looks like, and I applaud her, and I applaud your work, Josiah. But I do understand that self-loathing that we are taught from a very young age. It is a tool of colonization, and it was spread the world over. And it's something that we battle against. And once we rise above it, then we can empower ourselves. And it's what we must do. We must insist that our politicians treat our citizens as equals. And I was so moved to see that ceremony. I think it really, how many times I've thought, maybe I could move to Aotearoa. I don't want to be that far away from Yora Yora country, but I want that leadership here.
Josiah, how did it come about? There was an apology by our Prime Minister Kevin Rudd to the stolen generation, to people like Deborah, and that was given from the dispatch box at Parliament House, so the seat of power. And yet we saw Jacinda Ardern underneath, going through this ifonga, which is this traditional Samoan display of reconciliation, the draping over her of the fine mat, and explain what that's about, because that is public humiliation. That's what it's designed for, yeah?
It's a few things, but to answer the first part of how it came about, the government listened to the elders and people who were directly Dawn raided on what it would look like to have a space of healing, and that was the outcome that they were looking for. And so the community pulled together a series of things to happen over the 3.5 hours that would help show and that the government meant it, and that community who come could feel like it was real. And what actually was happening is, yes, the Prime Minister was sitting on the seat and her parliamentary and ministerial colleagues lifting the ia tonga, the fine mat, over her, and leaving it to some of the victims to lift that off her as a symbol of, we received your apology, and you are humbling yourself and humbling your government to the whim of the people, whether they're going to lift, because there's no expectation that the people have to lift it in our Pacific cultures. So it's a big risk to the Prime Minister to have gone through that. Now, I think we can safely say the Prime Minister knew it was very likely, almost definite, that it would be lifted. But still, there was that risk.
Yeah. This is interesting, Nigel, about activating communities. So Josiah works on this sense of understanding his identity and his heritage. There's power in that. People come together. And all of a sudden, things that seem impossible, 50 years of demanding an apology, and within a few short months, it comes about. The power of community.
I think it's the power of community, definitely, and kudos to to Josiah and everyone that came together and pushed for that. It's so powerful to take a part of your own story back and redefine it. But it also took a willing leader to participate in this, someone who, I'll use a different word to humiliation, who had the humility to engage seriously with the process and to be able to also invite that healing in. I could not see that happening in Australia. I mean, I could not see the current leadership humbling themselves in that way. In fact, what we end up having are these reduction of really important, symbolic and meaningful questions of identity and belonging reduced to cultural wars, reduced to divisive politics. And also the lack of humility in our politics, I think, has seeped so far to the point of damaging trust in our politics and politicians. You see the same sort of arrogance, for lack of a better word, politicians not apologizing for blunt errors. It took so long for them to apologize because of, the robo-debts. There is the car park scandal going on right now. I mean, you begin to see how that attitude, the lack of admitting failure in a genuine and powerful form, doesn't just affect, minority groups or indigenous people, but actually begin to affect the way our own government respond to us as citizens. Because the truth of the matter is, politicians are not running a company of machines. They're running a society with people and emotions. And what sometimes is needed is to see the true humanity of a leader, to be able to know that they will back you up as a human being. And that is so lacking in our current political space. And I could give you so many examples, and I would, it's so lovely to see it in New Zealand. I want to move there as well. It is just so beautiful to see. There is just so much humanity being brought together, and you can see how these communities truly connect as a people. And that, I think, that gives you a way of moving forward together.
Josiah, we've only got about 30 seconds left in the program. You weren't affected personally by this trauma, but there's such a thing as intergenerational trauma and your sense of belonging. So just in 10, 15 seconds, what does it mean actually to you?
It means we can breathe.
Oh.
Tell me what you mean.
Our story is not, people are not saying that we've made this up, accepting that it's real, willing to do things differently, and our politics being better.
Yeah.